Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to have all of you here today. We're going to get started. My name is Rebecca Tabor-Conover. I am head of public programs here at Connecticut's Old State House, and we're delighted to have you here for today's program. Before we get started, I wanted to express my thanks to a couple of other organizations who have helped us with today's program. This program is co-sponsored with Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history, and there are free copies available and back on your way out, and I would recommend that you consider joining and becoming a member of Connecticut Explored. They have wonderful articles, and actually our speaker today, that's how we found her, that she had a featured article. I also would like to express the Old State House's thanks to Connecticut Humanities. The Connecticut Humanities is the main funder of this program today in this series, and so we really appreciate their support. And on everyone's chair is a rack card, which the Humanities Council has helped to fund. So we hope you will come back for other opportunities to learn and discuss. A couple of things that I just want to mention that are going on here at Connecticut's Old State House. Please consider staying after the lecture concludes at 1 o'clock because we have a shop opening and we will have some light refreshments, and our shop is having a reopening after being closed for some time, so we hope you'll join us for that. I would also invite you to come back in December. We will be hosting a craft fair here at Connecticut's Old State House on December 10th, 11th, and 12th, and on the 10th, you'll notice there's a typo on the rack card. On December the 10th, we will be hosting a one-on-one conversation with one of Hartford's most famous residents, Mark Twain, and so we definitely hope you'll return for that. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Diane Smith, who will be the moderator for today's program, Conversations at Noon. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today for this conversation. Former Chief Justice William Rehnquist once wrote that the Romans had a saying that in time of war, the laws are silent. He added in that writing that during wartime, the United States government had often tightened up on civil liberties in the name of national security. One of the most memorable examples of that is at the heart of our discussion today. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise military strike against a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The bombing of Pearl Harbor signaled not only the official start of U.S. involvement in World War II, it marked a profound change in the fortunes of Japanese Americans. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that granted local, state, and federal authorities the right to forcibly relocate and incarcerate an estimated 110,000 Japanese Americans. 2/3 of the ones who were interned were U.S. citizens. More than 7 decades have passed, but the Japanese American internment is still relevant today. Not only because it still remains a deep wound for many people. In fact, today, just today, George Takei, the actor who's well known for his role on Star Trek, posted on his Facebook page that he, as a child, had been interned at a camp in Arkansas, and that the memories of that camp are now being remembered and commemorated, in fact, with a special website, and he's doing a virtual tour on that website. So that just happened today. By the way, if you want to look it up, the name of the camp was Rohwer, R-O-H-W-E-R, and you can find it on the web and see the new site. So it's relevant for many reasons, including the discussion on civil liberties today that surrounds the war on terror, whether it's surveillance by the NSA or profiling of Arab Americans and Muslims. Our main speaker today is Cathy Schlund-Vials, an associate professor of English and Asian American Studies and the director of the Asian American Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut. Professor?
Thank you so much. I've never actually been in this space, nor have I really ventured out of Willimantic or Storrs, so I was actually remarking, wow, there's traffic. But thank you so much. I really want to put a shout out, as it were, to both Rebecca and Diane for just helping me along here. As Diane had indicated, I do direct the Asian American Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut, and we do have a rather sizable oral history archive that involves actually former Japanese American internees. One of the interesting things about the University of Connecticut is that it was one of the few places that would accept internees seeking to finish their degrees in the United States. Mount Holyoke was another place, so thanks. So the focus of my talk, and I want to really emphasize talk, I'm not reading from anything, except I'm looking at some slides, is remembering internment. And what I oftentimes tell my students is that, there is the adage that history will repeat itself, but what is remarkable is how much is forgotten, even though this is a story that arguably is quite familiar, or more familiar now than when I was in school. In particular, just as an example, in 2004, Michelle Malkin, more commonly associated with Fox News, wrote a monograph that was focused on why internment was necessary. Right, so I want us to kind of think about historical amnesia with regard to this story. So one of the things I really want to emphasize, and I apologize for using the tiniest font possible for my slide, is that I want to really situate the internment within a longue durée history of anti-Asian sentiment. Oftentimes people that I run across, particularly students, will do a cause and effect analysis of the internment, saying that it was precisely because of Pearl Harbor that this happened. But I want to really kind of situate this within a longer history. So Asian migration, particularly Chinese migration, really began in the 1850s with the discovery of gold in California. And then in the 1860s, Chinese laborers were recruited to work on the railroad. What is interesting is that Irish workers were also recruited. They were able to bring their families. Chinese migrants were not. So that highlights from the outset the differential treatment afforded Asian immigrants versus European immigrants. In 1870, the Page Act was passed, and this is a piece of legislation that prohibited the migration of Asian women. And what's fascinating about this act is that it's not until 1945, with the War Brides Act, that you get the first en masse migration of Asian women to the United States. This prohibition occurred based on the assumption that Asian women were prostitutes and purveyors of vice. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and that is the only time in U.S. immigration history that a particular group was targeted. The 1882 Act was passed in relation to the emerging claims of white working class labor. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was specifically tied to Chinese laborers and the prohibition of them. And an analog with regard to that act is what has happened now with undocumented labor and immigrants. In particular, one way to think about this is that the discourse surrounding Chinese immigrants is very similar to the discourse surrounding, say, immigrants or migrants from Mexico. In 1893, the Chinese Exclusion Act was confirmed by way of the Geary Act, which extended that act for another 10 years. And in 1907, the shift from Chinese to Japanese occurs with the Gentleman's Agreement, which de facto prohibited Japanese migrant workers' entry into the United States. In 1917, you have the Barred Asiatic Zones Act. For those of you who are immigration law folks, this is interesting because it divided the globe in half and targeted not only Japanese, Chinese, but also Korean and South Asians. And in 1924, you have the most restrictive immigration act passed in U.S. history, the Johnson-Reed Act, and this is where Eastern Europeans, Italians, and other groups are targeted alongside Asian immigrants. And one of the things that I always stress to people with regard to the Johnson-Reed Act is that there's a wonderful book titled The Abandonment of the Jews. The author escapes me. This act was actually used to deny entrance for European Jews seeking refuge to the United States. So when we think about the story of the internment, it's very easy to think about it strictly within the context of Japanese Americans, but this is actually reflective of multiple types of policies against multiple bodies. One fun fact, and by fun, depressing, is that 1952 marked the first time Asian immigrants could get naturalized citizenship in the United States. They had previously been barred from attaining naturalized citizenship as a result of naturalization law, which after 1870 stressed those who were free white persons or of African descent could get naturalized citizenship. And certainly during the Q&A, I'd be more than happy to expand on that. And I am also looking to my legal colleague, Hope, over there, who could help me out here a bit. And in 1965, you have the Immigration Nationality Act, there's a typo on this slide, which enabled for the first time in U.S. history the en masse migration of Asian immigrants to the United States. The reason for that is linked to the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. But prior to that, immigration law tended to be nation-state focused. After 1965, it became hemispheric. So, for example, 120,000 people were allowed from the Western Hemisphere, 170,000 from the Eastern. So I wanted to just highlight, though, when we think about the Asian American experience in the United States, it is continually one of exclusion and prohibition. Okay. This slide, I think, actually highlights this. So these are two images. The one on the right, my right, is an ad for rat poison titled Rough on Rats. It clears out rats, mice, bedbugs, flies, roaches, and underneath it clears out, there is a statement that says they must go. What we see here is a stereotypical racialized depiction of a Chinaman who is actually about to eat a rat. So the logic of this ad is that if you just feed the rats the poison, then you will kill two birds with one stone and eliminate two problems. To the other side of that slide is the great fear of the period highlighting nativism. So we have the coolie figure, the Chinaman, and Uncle Sam is in the middle. And then we also have a very stereotypical depiction of an Irish immigrant, and you can see that they're chomping down on Uncle Sam. And the problem is that eventually the Chinese subject will consume not only Uncle Sam, but the Irish and still maintain the qualities of Chineseness, highlighting the inassimilability of this population. Okay? These are two images that I hope bring into context the treatment, the racialized treatment or representations of Chinese being put on Japanese Americans. So we have an image from a paper, actually a magazine titled The Wasp, which I think suggests it's politics. But we have a Chinese subject depicted, and the anxiety is that because Chinese were such that they were unskilled laborers who would work for half as much money, that they were taking over every industry in the United States. And then we have a Collier's magazine cover from December 12th, 1942, commemorating Pearl Harbor. And what I would like to really highlight for the remainder of my talk is the disconnect between the Japanese as enemy and the Japanese American as loyal subject. So, and it's not accidental that if you look at the slide for the Collier's magazine, that it would remind people at the time of The Wizard of Oz and the Flying Monkeys. Okay. So, as Diane had suggested in the opening, the Japanese-American internment is at least usually attributed to the December 7th bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, which necessitated the passage of Executive Order 9066. This is according to the dominant narrative by FDR, and Diane did a wonderful job of enumerating or summarizing that act. And between March and April of 1942, the en masse relocation of Japanese and Japanese Americans occurred. What you have here, though, is a slide that, like an image that was suppressed, taken by Russell Lee, documenting the internment. And as you notice, the emphasis is on children. Most of the suppressed slides, these were slides that were suppressed by the U.S. government until the 70s, emphasized that mothers and children were being interned. And so we kind of have to ask ourselves, well, why were these suppressed? What's interesting, people always ask, well, why were they taking pictures of the internment? And this was part of a U.S. Army surveillance. So many of you are probably familiar with the Farm Securities Administration photographers from the 30s. Many of those individuals were then put into the Office of War Information to document the internment. When we think about internment and anti-Asian sentiment, I also want to highlight how pervasive this is. So as many of you probably recognize, these are two images from Dr. Seuss. Prior to being a beloved children's writer, he was a political cartoonist for the leftist magazine PM. And these two images really highlight the extent to which Dr. Seuss's politics in terms of race did not actually extend to Japanese Americans. So we have an ad for war savings bonds that features Hirohito. And then the other slide, I think, is more telling because it's a justification for internment, titled Waiting for the Signal from Home. We see a number of individuals lined up, indistinguishable from one another, presumably Japanese or Japanese Americans, all along the West Coast. So California, Oregon, Washington State is highlighted. And what's fascinating is that after the period of the internment in World War II, you see some of these characters reused. But if you look at the plot of Horton Hears a Who and also the Sneetches, you see that Dr. Seuss kind of stepped back on that. He never made a public apology for his depiction of Japanese Americans. He did support the internment. To kind of save Dr. Seuss for people in the room, he also very much was focused on anti-fascism. So the depictions of German cruelty abroad and also Italian cruelty occurred alongside with Japanese, anti-Japanese sentiment. So I want to revisit the cause and effect argument as a context. So this is an image, Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood, so we see the use of a racial slur. And the question that I always ask is, what date do you think this photo was taken? How many of you, or maybe a better use, is how many of you would say that this photo was taken in the 40s? Okay. So, but it was actually taken in 1920 in Los Angeles. So, when we think about, again, a longue durée reading of the internment, it's important to note that there was anti-Japanese sentiment already in place, and actually quite racist anti-Japanese American sentiment. Now, what's interesting with regard to the cause and effect argument is that in 1940, the State Department actually commissioned C.B. Munson, who was from Detroit. He was actually an independent contractor, to do a report assessing whether or not the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast posed a threat. This was well before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but within the context of World War II. So the report was actually submitted October 7th, 1941, and ultimately it concluded that Japanese Americans on the West Coast posed no threat. And the reason why Munson came to this decision, he interviewed first-generation Japanese Americans, known as Issei, second-generation Japanese Americans, the Nisei. There were also second-generation Japanese Americans who had gone to Japan to study, known as the Kibei, and he didn't really have a lot of success interviewing the third-generation sensei because they were babies, okay? But one of the conclusion that he came to was that the first generation, though exhibiting some loyalty to the country of origin, had really made their lives here and were not planning on going back. The second generation, Japanese Americans, desperately wanted to prove their Americanness and actually considered themselves Americans because they were born here, as did the Kibei, who decided to return, and the sensei, again, posed no threat because they were children. Notwithstanding the findings of the report, General John DeWitt, who was charged with the initial stages and implementation of the internment, stressed that a Jap's a Jap, whether he's an American citizen or not. I don't want any of them. And like the images that you saw here, this particular image, the Munson Report, was actually suppressed until the 70s. And the question is, why did all these things happen in the 70s, outside of being a wonderful decade that witnessed my birth? The 70s was also the time where the Japanese-American redress movement was really going in full force. So to summarize and to highlight some inconsistencies with regard to internment, the estimates are 110 to 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated in camps that ranged from Wyoming, Arizona, and California, also in Arkansas. So to go back to the George Takei example, what's interesting is that while he's interned, this is also where the 442nd Japanese American Battalion is training. So those individuals, people like Senator Daniel Inouye, actually met their compatriot internees, but they were from two very different locations. The internment was not long-lasting insofar as individuals were released incrementally in 1944. The question is why. One, Japanese Americans proved quite valuable in terms of a labor market. Two, Japanese American men were needed to fight in the war effort. What's interesting about the 442nd, which remains the most decorated battalion with regard to military history, is that they are among the battalions that actually liberate the camps in Buchenwald. Okay. And also, for a pop culture reference, Mr. Miyagi from The Karate Kid is a member of the 442nd. Fun fact. Interestingly, Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not interned, given that Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. The question is, why not? And the answer is that an assessment done by plantation owners deemed that the entire economy would collapse if those laborers would actually had been interned. The one thing to note about the internment is that it was by no means limited to the United States. Japanese Canadians were also interned, as were Japanese Peruvians. So I'm nearing kind of the end of my talk, but I wanted to highlight two competing images or visions. So we have two very cute kids by barbed wire in an internment camp. And we have two headlines that appear close to one another. So one headline stresses that poll indicates Californians seek to eject all Japs, and then U.S. Japs in Italy hailed as heroes. So you see that there's kind of that it's quite a bifurcated characterization of Japanese and Japanese Americans. This goes back to the issue of, what? Oh, I'm sorry. That's an interesting question. So, because most that ended up happening, but the taking of property and the taking of houses oftentimes occurred when Japanese, particularly the Issei population, left those titles in the hands of their neighbors, who then sold them off, etc. So. That has been, that particular topic, I'm doing a bad job with the question, but that particular issue will come to haunt Japanese Americans trying to return. Many of them had property, but it might have been vandalized, or they just simply lost the titles, okay? Which is one of the reasons why the reparations that occurred paid out $20,000. Okay, good. But this is an example of Japanese American resettlement in Connecticut. So we have the University of Connecticut Wilbur Cross, and this is and the other image of the single gentleman is actually taken from Bridgeport. Okay. I want to actually conclude though with the relevance of this to the present day. So, and I think that this will actually focus the conversation with regard to resistance. So Fred Korematsu, Japanese American who actually protested the internment, went to court and stated that because he was an American citizen, his civil rights liberties were violated. And I'm not doing the best job with this, so I'm looking for help from my colleagues here. What's interesting about Korematsu is that he attempted to have a plastic surgery and passed for white. that failed, and he was ultimately interned. The court ruled that 6-3 that while he was an American citizen, because it was a time of war, the internment was justified. And there are other cases, but I wanted to highlight that there was resistance. We do see that Fred Korematsu in 1983, the case came before the Supreme Court, and at that point, the internment was deemed unconstitutional, right? And this is actually a big moment in the redress movement. We have Bill Clinton in 1998 awarding Korematsu the Freedom of Medal, the Freedom Medal? The highest honor given to a civilian. And again, this is part of a number of apologies during the Clinton administration. I'm going to bypass this slide because it's rather long, but in 2003, Korematsu actually wrote on behalf of plaintiffs who were seeking some degree of restitution for internment in Guantanamo Bay. And one of the things that I want to conclude with is what Korematsu had stressed not only in the brief, but at the end of his life. He passed away in 2005. So he actually supported plaintiffs against George W. Bush and also the Rumsfeld case involving Padilla. But his last words, I think, kind of resonate and serve as a nice transition. According to Korematsu, quote, "I'll never forget my government treating me like this, and I really hope that this will never happen to anybody else because of the way that I look, if they look like the enemy of our country." He urged others to, quote, "protest but not with violence, and don't be afraid to speak up. One person can make a difference even if it takes 40 years. Thank you very much.
While we're transitioning to our panel discussion, I'd like to invite people to come tomorrow to the Old State House, where we're actually hosting for the first time a naturalization ceremony in which 30 people will become citizens of the United States. And so that starts at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow.
So, thank you so much for being here. And Professor, you made the perfect transition with that discussion. In fact, you even mentioned the Jose Padilla case, which is particularly important to us in this discussion because Hope Metcalf, who is one of our panelists now from Yale Law School, has worked on that case. Hope is an associate research scholar in law and a lecturer in law. Hope's teaching and research focus on criminal justice reform and U.S.-based human rights violations. Hope Metcalf formerly directed the National Litigation Project of the Allard Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic, which was founded in 2002 to respond to infringements on civil liberties and human rights arising out of U.S. counterterrorism policy. Also joining us today, thank you so much, is Dr. Timur Yuskaev from Hartford Seminary, where he is assistant professor of contemporary Islam, co-editor of the Muslim World Journal, and co-director of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program at Hartford Seminary. His upcoming book, Speaking Quran: The Emergence of an American Sacred Text, examines contemporary written and oral interpretations of the Quran. So thank you so much for being with us, all of you, today. Hope, I thought it was so interesting that Cathy brought up Fred Korematsu and in particular his filing of that brief because it really ties into what's happening today. Tell me about the connections between what has happened over the last 12 years since 9/11 and what Cathy has talked about.
Sure. So I think there are similarities and probably a lot of differences, so we could talk about both. So to focus first on the similarities, after 9/11, as probably many of you are familiar, we were all in a great state of fear. I know I myself was in Manhattan on the day that the Trade Center was destroyed, and it was a very, very frightening time. And almost immediately thereafter, I think there was a sense of Congress, as well as the president, of wanting to do something and wanting not just to make us safe, but to help us feel safe. I think that was a real sense of obligation on the part of the government, and probably something that we were calling for as well. And by the we, I mean sort of the general popular sentiment. And so what we start to see are policies as well as public symbols to help make us feel safe. And so an example, perhaps most visible, was the creation of the declaration of war. First of all, that was the authorization of military force that Congress enacted in November 2001. And under that sort of very broad declaration that Congress gave to the president enacted widespread detention powers as well as interrogation powers of suspected terrorists, and chose, instead of to prosecute them as criminals, which could have been the choice, instead chose to use a sort of hybrid war on terror, is what it came to be known as, which therefore before then really hadn't been something that existed under international law and was sort of a new thing. And so the repercussions of that was we started to see, some of you may remember the pictures of people being brought to Guantanamo in January 2002, and the question was, well, who are these people, where are they coming from, and what's going to happen to them? And I think all of those questions were secrets held quite close to the chest. So while it was very visible and it was kind of a public spectacle, again, I think with this desire to make us feel safe, in fact, we knew very little, and people had to work quite hard even to just find out the names, the numbers, basic demographics of who was being held at Guantanamo. So Guantanamo is probably the most notorious and most visible example of what we start to see of this kind of militarized security, either just off US shore, or even on US shore. But there are lots of other examples, ranging from, for example, Jose Padilla, a gentleman I worked on behalf of for many years, was a US citizen seized on US soil, and first under regular civilian criminal authority was held in a jail in downtown Manhattan, but then the president declared him an enemy combatant, and he was taken to a military detention facility in South Carolina, where he was held and interrogated under really difficult conditions for almost 3 years, until he eventually was released to then go through the regular civilian criminal process. And other examples would be, I think we start to sort of, if those are sort of the center and sort of the most obvious departures from the rule of law and kind of what we come to expect of how our government treats us, you start to go out in concentric circles from that to other forms of departures. So for example, non-citizens who either are Muslim or look Muslim or are from countries of interest, I think was the term used, immediately post 9/11, there just starts to be large roundups under immigration authority, and those people are held, and maybe they're questioned by the FBI. So there starts to be sort of a blending and a blurring of boundaries between what's immigration status, what's the rule of law under military versus civilian, all of which is to help make us feel safe, and the target of which are people who are now newly described as Muslim. And I want to just note, I think it's important to flag, because I think this ties directly into the Korematsu case, the idea of looking Muslim is kind of, if you think about it, is kind of odd. It's not intuitive. In fact, of course, Islam is one of the largest religions in the world. It ranges from Indonesia to South Asia to here to Russia. So I don't know exactly what it means to be Muslim, but somehow we all tended to know what that meant immediately post 9/11. And there's notorious examples, for example, of Sikhs, which is, of course, a totally separate religion, being targeted because they wore turbans, et cetera. So I think that kind of the construction of who's the other, how that intersects with our own peculiar American history and our ideas of race, citizenship, who belongs, who doesn't, and now religion thrown into mix turned out to be a pretty powerful combination.
I should say, Professor Yuskaev, I saw you smiling when Hope said, we all instantly knew what it meant to look Muslim.
I smiled because it reminded me of a press conference that took place at a mosque in Brooklyn just shortly after 9/11. Around that time, I used to work at an organization called the Interfaith Center of New York. 2 days after 9/11, we held the first press conference by Muslim American organizations in New York City, denouncing what happened, and immediately the myth that emerged that Muslims do not denounce what happened, but they did. And there was a press conference at a mosque in Brooklyn where this conversation came up: who is Muslim, who gets to be searched? And I spoke at that press conference, and I made a statement that some Muslims look like me.
With blue eyes and light brown hair, and yeah.
But what I think Hope is highlighting is kind of the network of concepts that emerge, which also kind of, there are shadows of the past history, where race, religion, ethnicity, class, all of those things are intertwined, and what emerges at the end is a sense of a group of people being foreign, not belonging. It's quite interesting that the war on terror highlights kind of the spirit of the time, the spirit of fear. And so it's a minority, a group to be feared because they somehow do not belong.
Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, we want to open this up to questions, so if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll bring over a microphone so that we can hear you on the television program. But Cathy, I think maybe some people are thinking, okay, but in the internment camps we saw children, moms, who could think that they would be dangerous? Isn't there a difference between the people who were being rounded up after 9/11? And Cathy, maybe that's a question for you to start, but for all three of you to answer.
That's a really provocative, interesting question. I do think that a couple of things come to mind. One, in terms of religion, I do think that there's something to be said about like perceived foreignness that accompanied those encamped, notwithstanding whether or not they were children or whether or not they were mothers. In particular, I think that this highlights the point. After the internment, it was very difficult to find a Japanese American who would admit to being a practicing Buddhist. And in fact, after in the 1950s, we kind of see the rise of New Age Buddhism, Kerouac, etc., but it was very difficult. And one of the reasons why it was very difficult to have Japanese Americans admit to Buddhism or just etc. is the way that they were rounded up. So Buddhist temples were actually targeted along with their listing of names, etc. I do think that, like, to open up the question, yes, these are the people who are being interned. I think that, it's very important to get into the mindset, and the idea is notwithstanding their gender, notwithstanding, their age, they were enemies that were to be activated, right? So this goes back to a long-standing yellow peril discourse whereby Japanese Americans could not possibly be loyal because they ultimately were loyal to the emperor in that regard. So,
Timur, that reminds me, and you and I have talked a little bit about other religious minorities that were seen as, quote, problematic at different times in this country's history. When Cathy talks about being loyal to the emperor, it makes me think, as a Catholic, about Catholics who were thought to be more loyal to the Pope than to the United States.
It's, as I was listening to Cathy's presentation, several points just echoed with experiences of other minorities and experience of minorities today, in the past and today. Of course, Catholics have been a quintessential American problematic minority when it comes to a religious minority. It's from about middle of the 19th century until after World War II. Well, there was a book that was a best-selling book in the years of 1949 and 1950. It was a book by Paul Blanchard, American Freedom and Catholic Power. The basic premise of the book was that the US at the time faced two enemies. One is communism, another one is Catholicism. One of the responses to the book, which I think is very interesting, comes from a professor of church history who highlighted that at the time, that was kind of a state of art of the conversation at the time. He said, the real conflict is not between a church and state, or between Catholicism and Americanism, but between a culture which is based on absolutism, encourages obedience, uniformity, intellectual subservience. So the whole idea, Catholics belong to a culture which somehow contradicts the basic premise of the myth of what it means to be American.
Hope?
Oh, I think just just picking up on that, it reminds me actually of news reports that have come out over the last couple of years about the New York Police Department's approach towards counterterrorism. And so they developed a very elaborate handbook to train their sort of elite squad of counterterrorism officials, which is premised on the idea that there are certain types of Muslims who are dangerous regardless of what they're actually doing, and that it's a sort of pre-crime unit in a way. So if you can catch somebody on the trajectory before they become a terrorist, we'll all be more safe. And how do you know if somebody's on the trajectory to become a terrorist? And the handbook goes on to talk about this. You're going to look at where they spend their time. So you're going to how many days a week are they at the mosque? Are they going to tea houses instead of, say, bars, because that suggests a level of sort of orthodoxy? Are they growing a beard? Are they choosing to listen to hip hop, which, in certain neighborhoods might get you in trouble, but in this handbook is probably a good sign because it means you're sort of more interested in sort of American mainstream culture. So there's all of these signifiers that the handbook points to that if you were to line them up, you might say, well, actually, that just looks like a very devout Muslim. It really doesn't tell me much of anything about whether or not this is a person who wishes to use force or violence against the American government, or let alone civilians.
So, Timur, how have Muslims in this country changed their public discourse in light of that, or have they?
Absolutely. From the day one after 9/11, Muslims have denounced, Muslim organizations have denounced the events that happened. What is interesting is, and this may not sound like like something significant, but I would say is very significant. One, outside of the official organizations that represent Muslims, if you were to interview Muslims in the United States, and I would say around the globe, post 9/11, about what do they think happened on 9/11, one of the predominant answers would be some variation of a conspiracy theory, which is kind of interesting. What to me it signaled was almost kind of instinctual reaction. It's not us. We could not do that. We cannot make sense of it. Somebody else must have done it. And so there was this explosion, so to say, of conspiracy theories in the Muslim world about who had done it. In terms of kind of the practical work by Muslim organizations, recently, the most recent poll of American Muslim mosques has found something quite interesting. Over 90% of mosques in the United States, as of 2011, 2012, were engaged in interfaith activities. That's an astonishing number. I think it's unparalleled among other congregations belonging to other communities. So that demonstrates a kind of opening up. Because Muslims are under scrutiny, one of the ways of dealing with it is to open up and invite conversations. And it also has, the discourses have changed, the official discourses by Muslim organizations have changed. One example of that, a recent example, there is a prominent imam, religious leader in Boston, Suhaib Webb, who after the Boston Marathon bombing, he posted a letter for everyone to see, but it was directed at his community, his mosque. And he called it a letter of love to the Boston community. And that reflects, and it's online, people can see it, that reflects a kind of a state of awareness of the responsible discourse by people who represent Muslims has to be disciplined in a particular way. There are positive sides to it, but there are also, I think, there are some potentially negative sides to it. And maybe we can explore those as well.
I just wanted to pick up on that, which is that my experience of just how chilling this environment has been over the last 12 years. So many of my students are Muslim, and this tends to, when we think about post 9/11 issues, for those of us who don't come into contact, for example, with the FBI in our neighborhoods. We tend to think of this as an issue that's far away or remote, Guantanamo being sort of the touchstone. But in fact, I'll give you just a quick anecdote to explain how present this is in the lives of people in the US. So I organized with my students about 5 years ago at the request of a local mosque, a conversation just to educate mosque members about what their civil rights and civil liberties were. Very simple stuff that you would learn just, in a high school civics class. Things about, when the police come to you, do you have to let them in? The very basic things. And so we advertised it through the Muslim Student Association, various places. It was going to be on the Yale campus at the mosque's request because they felt like talking about rights made them a little bit nervous, so they asked if we could host it. We did. So we all show up. The students have practiced their things, and we show up, and there are 2 people in attendance. They come up very friendly, introduce themselves, and they're 2 FBI agents. And so I think that was 5 years ago. And so that was sort of an indicator, and they were there. They explained, they didn't hide the ball, but they explained that they were there just to get to know people. And from then on, I started getting contacts for, requesting to meet with me, sit down with me. I'm just so curious. Tell me about your students. Very, very friendly. And it turned out that what they were doing, we now know from the NYPD, which has many similarities with the FBI, is they were mapping. They wanted to know where all the Muslims were in New Haven. And that made any kind of political or just basic education very, very challenging. And I am proud to say that in that first session when we got the 2 FBI agents was a student of mine, Diala Shamas, who's now working at City University of New York Law School. And she has successfully, over the last few years, gone out, gained the trust of communities, and it is through those organizing efforts, joining with African American and Latino communities to challenge the stop and frisk policies, seeing commonalities across various communities to understand how it is that we can have real security rather than just a sense of security. And the strides gained amidst very challenging circumstances where people really felt threatened has just been very inspiring, because I certainly didn't figure out how to do it, but younger people did.
Kathy, I wanted to let you comment, and I also wanted to ask the audience if anyone has questions. I'll be with you in just 1 second, but you were nodding when Hope was talking about that.
I was not. Well, because an analogy is to like who actually heads the redress movement for Japanese Americans. And interestingly, it's not second-generation Japanese Americans who chose not to talk about it, right? They actually did not want to replay that, and they also wanted to highlight their Americanness. So if you were to actually be in an internment camp, you would likely hear jazz music. You would likely, there was an emphasis on Americanization, front and center. It's actually the 3rd generation, those who had the fewest memories of camp, that kind of spearhead this movement. But I was nodding because I think that what comes through consistently is the racialized dimension with regard to this post-9/11 moment. And I would actually kind of remind, and it's something that's often forgotten, that in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, several news agencies stress this bears the mark of Middle Eastern terrorism. And then when you come to find that it's actually 2 individuals who are members of white supremacy groups, there's a way in which that becomes an individualized as opposed to a communal act. So that was just actually an observation that came through.
Yes, I think we had a question right there.
Speaking of agitation, taking the story back to the Japanese internment, one can't be anything but horrified at the violations of civil liberties that involved. And one wonders how much of a pushback there was, and from whom? The Justice Department. Where was the ACLU? Labor unions. So I'm wondering where there was pushback in the Japanese internment situation, and whether it was less than the kind of pushback that we've seen in the past 10 years.
That's a great question, Kathy.
In terms of pushback, and I want to complicate this story a bit because there were certain Asian American groups that actually benefited from internment. One group was Chinese Americans who were actually afforded the right to naturalize, and this is linked to the global imaginary, right? So because China is an ally Chinese Americans become our allies too. So to kind of go back to Hope's example of how to distinguish a dangerous versus like a safe Muslim, you would be issued like how to tell a Jap from a Chinese person. And this was actually something that was featured in Life magazine. Korean Americans tended to support the internment, in part because of Japanese colonization. So you see how this becomes quickly a transnational story. There were moments of resistance, but those individuals who were deemed agitators were placed more in less of an internment camp, but more in an incarceration center at Tule Lake. So you did have some of that. Interesting with regard to the Korematsu case, the ACLU tended to not want to use that as the case that would represent civil liberties because there was such a disconnect with regard to kind of the left and anti-fascism. Right, so this is actually emblematized, I think, by the Dr. Seuss cartoon. And although there were, like the NAACP, nobody really wanted to touch this case. However, what's interesting is that the Quakers actually rose. And this is one of the reasons why, like, what is it, the American Friends? Yeah. Service Committee were from the outset protesting the internment and also were responsible for resettlement, which is how Japanese Americans came to Connecticut, former internees.
I think there's a question right here. Let's bring the microphone over here.
Just a couple of comments that, first of all, South Pacific, the song You've Got to Be Taught to Hate. The only Native Americans are the Indians. I mean, all these others came from elsewhere. And a lot of the people that came on the Mayflower and other ships were people that had to get out of England because it was either that or go to jail. But people turn on different groups. I mean, the blacks are dirty. They live in lousy neighborhoods. They do the same thing with the Eastern Europeans. I'm trying to think, what is the group? Hispanics, well, they're violent. The Jews, look at them, Shylock, and they're money lenders, money grabbers. They control the motion pictures. Well, who created it? And by the way, most of the motion pictures created an America that everybody strived for. An Ozzie and Harriet type of lifestyle that everybody said, gee, this is what we want to do. Well, it was created by the Jews, and they talk about, the Shylocks out of Shakespeare, but a bunch of things. By the way, when are the people in Guantanamo going to get their day in court?
Well, that's a perfect question for you, Hope.
So some of them have had a day in court, and the sad truth is that regardless of whether or not they get their day in court doesn't necessarily mean they get released. So there have been dozens of cases where after many years of fighting, a federal district judge has said to the government, you really don't have enough evidence. And just a little legal point here, not that it's, beyond a reasonable doubt, but there's not even a preponderance of the evidence. You can't even show it's more likely than not that this person is a terrorist, thus, so that you could keep him. Even then, because of the way Congress has tied the administration's hands, that person isn't released. So sadly, even when the day in court comes, they're still there.
Well, in Hope, aren't you working on cases for detainees in Bagram now?
Yes.
And I believe you told me you had a client who's been held for 12 years and has never seen a lawyer.
That's correct.
I think most of us find that pretty stunning.
Most Arabs still have their embassies in the United States and in Washington, D.C. Congressman Larson, I was talking to him about a month ago. He said that the Arabics he goes to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and everything, and he said there's no problem. The commerce still flows. All of our clothes come from the Middle East. A lot of our basic food needs come from the Arabic. So, and that from point of view that the embassies are still open, the commerce is still moving back and forth. So, he said I don't have a problem.
That's an interesting point. I think that probably goes to show just how confusing this war paradigm can be, because we think of wars as being between different countries. But here, a war against terror, or really as it's been defined under the statute, is a war against Al-Qaeda and its associates. And that's not a particular country. So it leaves us all quite confused, I think.
And I think when we talk about the differences and the similarities between the Japanese-American internment and what's happening today is that I opened today by saying that Chief Justice Rehnquist had said that in times of war, certain laws are suspended. But that was a war that had an end. Mm-hmm. We knew when that ended. How does this war ever end? Timur?
And I think this is where absolutely, the fact that this is a war against entities that are not state entities. So that's important. But the other side of it is that it is somehow tied to religiosity, to religion, and people who are religious. And this is where I think there is a particular kind of almost promise of it being a very long war. And to just highlight, you started with a quote from a Supreme Court judge. Just recently, another Supreme Court judge, Antonin Scalia, got into a little bit of a controversy because he said that he believes in the devil, and the devil is real. Well, he was speaking like a Catholic. And there was a huge scandal about how can a person on the Supreme Court talk in such a language, which highlights kind of highlights some of the limits to what it constitutes acceptable discourse and what constitutes us and them, and to what extent people who are religious, however they are defined, are allowed to function as people who are religious.
Can I just make one quick comment, which
Please.
is to say, I think that there is a view in which this is a long-term, there's been a huge disruption. We are still at sea and to some degree still at war. We obviously do have active conflicts still going on in Afghanistan in particular. However, I think it is important to note that some things have changed. So as not to be completely doomed and gloomed here. George W. Bush started to turn away from some of his more extreme policies in the second half of his presidency, and Obama has made some very important changes. I think it's notable that in the last 3 high-level terrorism suspects who have been taken into custody, they did not end up at Guantanamo. They were briefly detained and interrogated under unusual circumstances. One of them was on a naval ship in the middle of the ocean. However, there was a choice made, and he took a lot of heat from it, from members of the Republican Party for not bringing them to Guantanamo, but choosing instead to prosecute them under the criminal justice system. So I think that the sort of more extreme distortions of our rule of law, I am hopeful and optimistic that they will come to a close, but I think nonetheless real damage has been done, and there are other subtler forms of discrimination and profiling that continue to exist, and that I hope that we'll be addressing.
I think we had a question right here.
First of all, thank you all for being here, addressing the crowd. Really appreciate, the topic especially. Decades after Japanese internment and, or essentially after slavery, the government still engages in pretty vicious and severe practices of isolation of various different groups, whether it's the, pervasive infiltration and monitoring of South Asian Muslim and Arab groups in New York City, especially by the NYPD and FBI, nationwide really, the continuing mass incarceration of Black and Latino folks, and just policies that end up having adverse impacts on the poor of the country as well. But and Hope mentioned, there are ways that the racial groups, the Latino groups, the Arab groups, the Black groups, the African American groups, the immigrants who also are facing detention, deportation at historical rates. We're coming together slowly, but we are coming together and we are discussing ways. And as an activist on the ground here in Connecticut, we engage. Many various different groups because we all have a similar interest. But when it comes to thinking outside of the racial groups, how do the racial groups express to the rest of the nation that, this is not only problems that are impacting the civil liberties and human rights of these racial groups, but really these are problems that are stripping away civil liberties and human rights, period. No matter what color you are, no matter what gender you are, no matter where you come from, these are rights that, if you're in America and our values suppose that we uphold freedom, we uphold equality, justice. How do we express, we as in, the racial groups, express to everybody that we are all stakeholders in this, we all need to act out against this, because if not, we're all going to be victims of it, no matter what color you are.
And that is a great point, and actually that's the point that I thought we should end on today. So I'd like to ask each of you to respond, kind of have your last summary to this young man's question. Cathy?
That's a really great observation question. I mean, I think that that's where history provides a usable pass with regard to the civil rights movement, right? So, oftentimes we think of the civil rights movement as a black-white movement, but it was far from that, right? Actually, as Malcolm X had been assassinated, Yuri Kochiyama, a Japanese-American internee, was cradling his head. So one of the things that I would suggest is to shift the discourse so that it's not so individualized, but instead you're looking at a systemic critique. And what I mean by that is that, it's very easy to kind of say this is a black problem, this is a Latino problem, this is even a Cambodian problem, and that's kind of, I work a lot with Cambodian American deportees. But I think that going back to the usable past of the civil rights movement, but also shifting the discourse so that we're not only reliant on kind of legal imaginaries, but also we seek out other social justice apparati, whether it be education, whether it be just kind of being in the community, et cetera. That's just one suggestion.
Timur?
Yes, one of the kind of dangers of the post-9/11 environment is that there are groups of Americans and others who feel intimidated and who do stay quiet. And there is nothing more American than being a participant in a public discourse. It's not government versus us, we are the government. Governance is a dialogical process. One of the, I think, hopeful things that I have seen develop, and I think it reflects in that statistics about over 90% of mosques in the United States involved in interfaith activities, I see that this environment has prompted people to form new alliances and open new lines of communication, finding language that they share, experiences that they share, and be participants in public life in broader coalitions. And I think that's where the hope is.
Hope?
So I guess I would think of it that so I, for example, didn't come to these issues from a place of personal experience, but I felt that because I had certain types of privilege in terms of education, et cetera, that it was important for me to educate myself deeply and to reach out to people. And so, in terms of interfaith things, my first visit to a mosque was going to listen and to kind of have that cultural exchange in a real and humble way. I think humility is actually a really important part of this. And then sort of thinking in terms of what can we carry away from this last decade or so. There's typically the debate is teed up as liberty versus security, and I reject that binary. I think instead we might ask what kind of security, because we all want to feel secure and we all have a right to feel secure. But there are different kinds of security, and is it a short-term security, and at what costs and at whose cost? And am I going to ask that I feel secure because someone else is bearing the costs? And so I think our politicians are quick to offer us a false kind of security, and I think if we instead ask them to give us a real and genuine and long-lasting security that is based on a sense of shared values, common culture, and bringing people in rather than pushing them out, I think we'd all be better served.
Thank you so much for a really thought-provoking and wonderful discussion, all three of you. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'd invite you to join us with the shop opening that is going to be taking place in just a moment. And also, I would ask that we will be sending out surveys via email, and we really do appreciate your feedback from today's program. And if you didn't register online, if we don't have your email, please go into the shop and sign up to receive some of our email blasts, and that way you can make sure not to miss the next program here at Connecticut's Old State House. Thank you very much.